Okay, I guess it's recorded to the computer. It didn't give me an option. Okay.
Yeah, when you close it, have you recorded in Zoom before? When you close your session, it will pop up and tell you where it's at.
Okay, I was doing cloud recording at first, and that actually did not work very well. So now I've been recording to my computer.
Okay. All right, well, I think that most of the people are here, so we can go ahead and get started. I'll do a quick introduction. I think most of you probably know Dr. Simpson. Mike Simpson is the chair of our department. He came to the University of Utah, was it 5 years ago, about?
It's G7 now.
Holy smokes. So he's been here as long as I have. He came from INL, though, where he'd worked for a number of years as a staff scientist there at Idaho National Lab. And we're excited to have him here, and he's our resident expert on all things nuclear. So we're excited to hear about metallothermic reduction processes in molten salts.
Thanks, Taylor. Yeah, it's an honor to be able to speak to you today, and it's an honor to be serving the department in this really exciting time. Well, things were a lot more exciting before about March or February this year. So I hope everyone's hanging in there. Hope everyone's safe, and wish we could be doing this in person, but again, hopefully soon. So I'm going to talk about just one aspect of my research. This actually presentation was largely from a presentation I gave at TMS back in February, last business trip I've taken this year. And I thought it has some interesting fundamental aspects to it. I'm gonna try to frame things in terms of the applications, but I'm also going to kind of dive into some more fundamental chemistry as well. Hopefully get you interested in this field of molten salts. Figure out how we do this. Okay. All right. So molten salts, what are we talking about? Well, there's actually, molten salts is a very broad area of material or type of material. I primarily focus on chlorides and fluorides, meaning that these are salts like sodium chloride, but the anions are generally either chloride ions or fluoride ions. Now there's others like nitrates and bromides and so on. Not used quite as much, and since my interest has been in nuclear material processing, chlorides and fluorides pretty much dominate the landscape. So what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with temperatures almost always above 100 degrees Celsius, typically up around 500 degrees Celsius. I'd say we can go as high as about 1,000 degrees before the salts start having problems with like vaporization. They're anhydrous, at least they're intended to be anhydrous. Water doesn't like to stick around at that high of a temperature. What happens is if there is water in the salt, it first volatilizes, off gases. And then if it sticks around long enough, it actually hydrolyzes. It reacts with the salt to form acidic gases like hydrogen chloride and hydrogen fluoride. That's actually a problem. We try to avoid that from happening. And then they form solutions. So you've got lots of different these metal ions, cations like lithium plus and potassium plus, uranium 3+, and they're kind of mixing around in this pool with these chloride ions or these fluoride ions. So it's a lot of ionic bonding. I mean, if I'm not saying that it's all ionic bonding, there are some sort of polymeric type structures that have been hypothesized. I think it's safe to say that they're almost entirely ionic, and they make really good electrolytes. Now, think about when you do, like, most of the electrochemistry you've thought about or dealt with has been done with water. Water has a 1.23 volt window, and that's the maximum voltage range you can achieve because you start to electrolyze the water. And that doesn't give you a lot of power to tailor the chemistry or fine tune the chemistry. I can, if I have a big potential range, then I can cause certain reactions to occur at certain potentials. And molten salts have ranges from 3 to 5 volts. So a lot of action can happen there, a lot of chemistry, we can do some things. We can change the salt. We can use it for analysis measurement. A lot of things that we can do with such a big window. So molten salt electrochemistry is kind of my favorite subfield, and it's definitely a big subfield. Now let's talk about oxidation reduction. You're probably pretty familiar with redox chemistry from probably one of your general chemistry, first year chemistry classes. The top equations here just show these very generic reactions. You know, gaining an electron is a reduction reaction. Losing electrons an oxidation reaction. Okay, great. Well, those tend to be, because of the fact that the salts, for them to be in solution, they need to be, typically have to be ionic. Being able to run these processes to control whether you're reducing or oxidizing, there's a lot of power over how the salt behaves, what the chemistry, the composition of the salt is. So by controlling these reactions, we can do things like separate metals. You can pull, you know, if I've got uranium in the salt as a salt, like uranium trichloride, you can actually precipitate it out. I can make it go to metal, and then it drops out because it's not soluble anymore. I can also change the corrosivity of the salt. So I can, you know, depending on how much I push the oxidation potential, I can cause it to want to corrode metals or make it spontaneously corrode metals. So yeah, so there's a lot of things we do. We can also synthesize salts. We can make some of these compounds like UF3, UCl3, UCl4. We can actually make those by, say, starting with a metal, reacting that metal with an oxidizing species, and then making the salt from that. So it's a lot of powerful things we can do. Okay, so what are some of those, what kind of oxidation states are stable in molten salts? I'm picking primarily elements here that I'm interested in because they're involved in nuclear material processing, like uranium, plutonium, cerium, cesium. So uranium, plutonium are typically fuels, like in nuclear fuel, you would use uranium, plutonium. You might also use uranium, plutonium for nuclear weapons too. Cerium and cesium are fission products. They're formed from the fissioning of the uranium or the plutonium. Chlorine and fluorine would be, you know, they'd be there as your anions in your salt. And so I've color-coded this. So like uranium could be a metal, a solid metal, uranium. It could, or if it's green +3 or +4, it can go into the salt. It can be soluble in the salt. So it forms a solution. Same thing with plutonium, similar with cerium. Cerium only has one oxidation state that's stable in the salt. Cesium also has one. And then chlorine and fluorine, if you oxidize it, in other words, you take an electron away, you'll form a gas. Okay, so chlorine, Cl2 and F2 are gases. So we have different phases. We control the oxidation states of the salts. We can control the phases. We can do separations. Okay. All right. So what originally inspired this presentation was I was invited, or I should say I asked for an invitation and I got it, to give a talk at a symposium honoring Don Sadoway. He's a pretty well-known metallurgist and material scientist at MIT. He's currently doing a lot of work on molten salt batteries. And so they were doing I think it's his 70th birthday symposium. And I didn't really know Professor Sadoway very well, but I certainly appreciate his work. And so I wanted to have a chance to get up and talk in front of him. So luckily some of my friends were the organizers and they got me an invitation. And I said, you know, I'm going to take this paper that Professor Sadoway and one of his colleagues, Okabe, wrote back, well, it's been like 22 years now. And I said, I think this this is kind of inspires some of my work, and I think a lot of the things that I've done can kind of be framed in sort of this basic theory that Akabe and Sadaway published. And what it basically is called electronically, this is kind of a mouthful, electronically mediated metallothermic reductions in molten salts. So the idea is I can reduce these metals in these molten salts. In this case, we're looking at tantalum and the reactions we're looking at here. We could reduce them by reacting sodium with tantalum fluoride. So it's basically tantalum fluoride combined with potassium fluoride. Sodium reacts with it, you make metallic tantalum. If that's a valuable metal, you can recover that to make tantalum type parts and stuff. And their idea was that, so to give a little background, sodium at the temperature that the salt's a liquid is also a liquid. So we have metallic sodium. Their idea was that this reaction is, even though they were like tossing sodium metal into the molten salt and watching it react, the tantalum's falling out, they thought it was probably electronically mediated, meaning that there were electrons being transferred, okay? Even though they didn't set it up as like an anode and a cathode. That would be what we call long-range electronically mediated reduction. If I have a cathode and an anode and they're connected by a power supply, I'm pushing electrons through there. The idea of the short range is basically you've got atoms, you got ions and atoms that are close to each other, and over the length scale of angstroms, these electrons are being transferred. But if it works that way, it should also work in a long range. So we could basically we have a choice here. We could throw sodium in the salt and drop out the tantalum, or we could set up a cathode and an anode and then control it really well, because we can control the current or the potential. And it might just be a better, more intelligent way of running the reaction than just throwing the sodium in and letting it go. So that's the basic idea. This is kind of some sketches that show what I mean by short range versus long range. Electron jump, if it's short range, you basically have a sodium atom. It's possible that sodium atoms might be soluble, is oxidation state 0 in the salt. And the electron has given up from that sodium to the tantalum, reduces it down. Eventually you got five of these sodiums will eventually give up an electron, and you'll go all the way to tantalum 0 or tantalum metal. So that'd be short range. Long range again would be this, you got an anode and you got a cathode, and you have a power supply, and at the anode you oxidize sodium, and at the cathode you reduce tantalum. The idea of this kind of unified theory of electrically mediated reductions is that it's the same basic thing. Whether it's short range or long range, it still pretty much works the same. So I found that was kind of intriguing. And I just sort of thought about it many years after I started working on some of these processes. So these are the things that I work on. So I work on nuclear applications. I'm interested in nuclear energy, advanced nuclear reactors, recycling of nuclear fuel, all this stuff. And there's sort of 4 areas I want to highlight here, how molten salts are used for processing nuclear materials. First one, recycling. Okay, so if I take a fuel rod that maybe has metallic uranium or uranium oxide in it, that fuel has only been partially fissioned. There's still a lot of energy value left. There's still a lot of fissile material left in that fuel. If we can do a chemical process where we separate that useful uranium or some plutonium as well, and refabricate that back into fuel, and then I take what's left and I put it into a waste form, and that can make a lot of sense. I get a lot more energy out of my resource. So that's nuclear fuel recycling, or we sometimes call it reprocessing. Okay, status. So I'm putting a little parentheses so you know, well, okay, is this real or is this in someone's imagination? It's in use. It's been this has been in use. They don't use the molten salt-based processes haven't been like commercialized, but they've been operated in places like Russia and INL, where they've been processing spent fuel from some of their test reactors using molten salts as the medium, as the electrolyte. Okay, so that's one thing. And the picture here on the right shows what we'll call an electrofiner. So this has got a pool of molten salt in it. It's got a cathode and an anode. The spent fuel is oxidized in the anode, and the uranium is deposited on the cathode. They've been doing that actually since about 1996. That's actually the year I started working there, fresh out of grad school. Next, actually an older process than that is nuclear weapons pit processing. So here's a picture of a plutonium metal that has been electrofined. So the electrofine is used to purify it. What happens in these nuclear weapons that are plutonium based is over time they get a slow development of some minor actinides like neptunium or americium just from spontaneous fissioning or decay form, and eventually those weapons become unstable. Right? They don't trust that they're going to be safe, or they're not going to be as functional as they were designed to be. So after a certain number of years, I don't know what number of years are, places like Los Alamos take these weapons, take them apart, take the plutonium metal out of the pits, and then put those in molten salt, electrofine them, and then recast them back in. So that's been going on probably since the 60s, I think. So that's in use, definitely in use. Molten salt fueled reactors, like shown in the bottom diagram here. The idea is that instead of having something like a fuel rod, we're gonna put the fuel into liquid form, and we're gonna pump it around a loop, and that's gonna have all kinds of advantages. Okay, that's something that's been demonstrated. So most notably in the 1960s at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, they built what was called the molten salt reactor experiment. I think they ran it maybe for a few years. They didn't run it very long, but they did actually run it, gain power out of it, demonstrated it. Then what happened was the U.S. government changed its priorities and said, you know what, this advanced reactor technology wasn't really a top priority for them, so they put it on a shelf for quite a long time. But now it's coming back. So now, since in fact, a couple of the projects that funds my research group is based upon the need to develop technology for molten salt fuel reactors. So right now I'd say they're one of the leading candidates for the next generation of nuclear reactors. So it took a few decades to get back to that idea. So that's been demonstrated. And then finally, molten salt cooled reactors, that's where you would just use the salt as a coolant. You know, the fuel might be something like pebbles, like triso-coated, carbon-coated fuel pellets. The salt just happens to be a nice coolant because you can take it to very high temperatures without having to pressurize it. Water is a good coolant too, but you have to pressurize it quite a bit in order to run the reactor at a high temperature. We want to push the reactors to higher and higher temperature. To do that, we need fluids that don't have very high pressure at that high temperature. And water's not a good choice. Gas like helium is an okay choice. Liquid sodium is an okay choice. Salts is a good choice too. So these are all the applications that I'm that I got my hands into. All right, back to reduction processes. So we got this idea, like I'm interested in all these nuclear material applications. We talked about the work of Sadoway and Akabe about reduction processes. Okay, where does the fundamentals kind of meet the applications? Where does this get interesting? So there's three specific research topics I'm going to talk about today. If I have time, I may have to cut it short. The first two fall in the category of used nuclear fuel reprocessing. Okay, so this is the idea. I take fuel out of a reactor, like it could be a light water reactor, like we have currently. Most of our reactors are light water reactors, and we recover something useful out of it. You know, something that can make new fuel. So that's going to include reduction of uranium oxide. It's going to involve reduction of uranium trichloride. In the first case, I'm trying to go from UO2, uranium oxide, to a metal. Second case, I'm trying to go from uranium trichloride to a metal. And I'll try to explain as we go why we do those things. And then finally, I'm going to look at the coolant application. This is like advanced nuclear reactors. I'm not going to necessarily look at the MSR so much. In this particular case, I'm looking at FHR, which is basically it's the fluoride salt high temperature reactor. It's the salt cooled reactor. This is when we've got pebble fuel, which is going to flow this salt through it as the coolant. And it also, that interestingly applies to fusion. There's a concept for a fusion blanket that involves this salt. And that particular project here is looking at controlling what we call the redox potential of this salt we call FLiBe, which is lithium fluoride, beryllium fluoride, using beryllium metal. And so basically what that does is it helps you keep the salt from becoming too corrosive. We don't want the salt to be corrosive because then basically what happens is your containment material corrodes and you have to replace your core vessel or your piping every few years, and that would be very expensive. We have to design systems where corrosion doesn't require your replacement materials for decades, not years. So we have to control the redox potential. Okay, so first, actinide reduction. All right, two types of reduction that I'm going to talk about. One is uranium oxide going to uranium metal. That's it's a process that we carry out in molten lithium chloride. And then the next one is going to be going chlorides to metals. In the particular, that actually, we could do that in almost any salt. The salt that we tested this in, I'm going to give you some data, show you some results, was in this eutectic lithium chloride, potassium chloride. Okay, so this is the flow sheet. This is what we call pyro processing. This is kind of the meat and potatoes of what my job was for a bunch of years while I was working at INL. Okay, so let me kind of go through this process a little bit, and then I'll show you what we're going to focus on. So in this process, you bring in spent fuel. In this case, we'll assume it's oxide fuel. So it's like uranium oxide. Well, first it goes into direct electrolytic reducer. That takes the uranium oxide to uranium metal. Then we take that reduced metal, take it to a cathode processor where you would basically distill the salt off of it. Because when you pull the reduced uranium out of the salt, it's got a lot of salt on it. Salt just like sticks to it. Like it freezes, crusts on it. So you got to evaporate all that salt off. Now you got a piece of metal. You take that to the electrofiner. The electrofiner has molten lithium chloride, potassium chloride in it. In the electrofiner, that metal gets purified. It gets basically electrofine from an anode to a cathode, and then you make either uranium, or a mixture of uranium and transuranics. That becomes your product. And this product is purified, meaning that all those fission products like cesium and cerium and lanthanum and so on have in theory been removed. So now you've got kind of a clean material. And so again, you do another cathode processor, drive off the salt, and now you have a uranium, let's say it's your uranium ingot that looks like this. This picture actually shows a gripper inside the hot cell, manipulator hands holding a uranium ingot that came out of this cathode processor. And that is a relatively pure uranium. Okay? And now I can take that and I can make new fuel out of it. Now, there's some side processes in this. You've got some waste, like you have some metals that you're not going to use. You're going to cast those into a metal, and then you're going to send them to a repository. You're going to take salt out. You're going to take salt to, so here's one ceramic waste here. There's another ceramic waste here. Ceramics, we basically take salts that are contaminated with radioactive materials, and we put them in waste forms. Okay, so the two things I'm talking about in this seminar related to reduction and pyro processing are, first, this direct electrolytic reduction, and then second, this actinide drawdown. Actinide drawdown's purpose is to get the actinides out of the salt before you send the salt to waste, because we want to recycle. We want to get all the actinides back in the electrofiner, and we want to use it to make new fuel. So it's very important that we don't bleed out the actinides into our waste stream. Okay, how does direct electrolytic reduction work? Well, got some equations here on the left. These are what we think happens. We think that these are the fundamental steps. So what's happening here is I'm taking some spent fuel that's mostly uranium oxide, and I'm putting it into a cathode basket, and now applying a cathodic or negative potential. So I'm trying to make reduction occur. Now, I'll draw your attention to the graph on the right. This was published by a colleague of mine, Steve Herman, about 13 years ago. I think I'm a co-author on the paper. But it's really Steve's work. This is a cyclic voltammetry of this uranium oxide. So he's got a basket containing uranium oxide. He puts it in the molten salt. You sweep the potential back and forth between these endpoints, and you measure the current. And so current indicates a reaction. So he actually uses, his convention is that positive is reduction and negative is oxidation. So this black curve is basically the spent fuel. And he sees a bump here, or a peak right here we think is UO2 reduction. And then a little bit farther, it sort of takes off into lithium reduction. The idea here is that if I control the potential at, say, minus 1.6 volts, I'm only going to reduce UO2. If I go farther, I'm going to reduce lithium. That's not terrible, because once I reduce lithium, like via this reaction here, I make lithium, then lithium will react with UO2 it will reduce UO2 chemically. And I think this is short range reduction. The upper one's long range reduction to make uranium. And so the question here is like, okay, I think this fits within Sadoway and Akabe's idea here of electronically mediated reduction. And I think I got one long range option and one short range option. I can do either one, and just by controlling the potential. So the question then becomes, well, which is better? So we run experiments. So the experiments I'm reporting here were originally done by Dr. Adam Burak, who was a PhD student working for me. He's now at University of Michigan as a research scientist there. And Jeremy Chamberlain, who might be listening right now, I don't know, he's currently a PhD student in my group. Okay, so this is an experiment we do. We put this in a glove box, inert argon atmosphere. We have a furnace. We heat it to 600 and, well, I think it's more like 650 degrees C. And we put the cathode basket, shown kind of on the right here, that's going to be loaded with uranium oxide. And the anode is a platinum plate. All right, so we're gonna set this up, and we're gonna run various experiments, controlling the current or the potential, and then taking the reduced product out and analyzing it, seeing what we get. All right, this is the cathode basket design that Adam came up with. The trick here is that we wanted to work with a very small amount of material. We didn't have a lot of uranium oxide. I mean, we can handle hundreds of grams of uranium oxide, but we want to do lots of experiments, so we didn't want to generate a lot of uranium waste. So this is actually designed to hold 1 gram of uranium oxide per run. And it's kind of complicated because we wanted to be able to polarize the center of it. We didn't want to polarize the basket. Oops. Okay. We didn't want to polarize the basket wall. So this perforated stainless steel is the outside of the basket. That held the uranium oxide in place, but we didn't want it to become cathodically charged because we didn't want reaction to occur on the surface of the basket. You also wanted to be able to rotate the basket as well. So it's kind of complicated here. You had to put a mesh inside the basket. There's a base. Anyway, that's basically how it's, the center lead here is what becomes charged. And he's got some magnesia. Some magnesium or magnesium oxide is one of the better ceramics for working in this salt. Okay, so here was our hypothesis. We thought we could actually control whether we had this electrolytic reduction, like we're directly reducing UO2, or we're doing it indirectly by reducing lithium, and then lithium reacts. So in the left picture here, the contacted state, the lead is actually contacting the UO2, and it should be possible to directly reduce that. Over here, on the right side, we put a magnesium sheath to make it so the only contact between the lead was with the salt. And so that would have to make lithium, then lithium would diffuse to the UO2 and react to form it. So in theory, the left would be this long range type reduction, because basically we're treating it like a cathode, and the right would be a short range, where we're making lithium and the lithium is reacting with UO2. Okay, so there's some data that was collected. What we see on the left is the current versus the time. Okay, well, actually current and potential. So the left axis is current, and that's actually these top bars here. So basically it's a pulsing. It's like he's turning on 0.4 amps and then going to 0, 0.4 amps, 0, just kind of pulsing it to give the lithium oxide time to get out of the basket. And then here, this is the potential of the cathode lead. It's very interesting. Basically, if you put the lead not in contact with UO2, the potential was lower and very steady than when it was in contact. And so we draw lines directly to this CV that Steve Herman produced, saying, I think we got it. I think we could actually, by controlling what the lead's in contact with, we can either do this lithium reduction, the red curve, or we can do this UO2 reduction, the blue curve. Okay, good. We can control it. So what? Well, we need to analyze the product. So we ran these experiments where we you know, we either did it one way, the other way, either in contact or out of contact. And then we try to get all the salt off the baskets. We spin it, we heat it, we do a quick wash, everything we can do to try to get to the point where we can determine two things. One is, what's the concentration of lithium oxide left in the UO2 entrainment? And what's the extent of reduction of UO2 uranium metal? And we tried to get pretty close to 100. We tried to get around 90% reduction. And on average, that's about where we're at. So we're getting good reduction. Interestingly, the entrainment was quite a bit higher when we isolated the lead than when it contacted the UO2. So the conclusion here is that when we do this direct reduction, this long range reduction, we actually get a better result than if we do this short range reduction shown here. So this seems to be a good example of how when you recognize that you can break it out into like a cell, you can control the process better, you can actually get a better result. Because we want this entrainment to be as low as possible. Okay, moving on. I'm probably not going to cover everything today. Electrofiners. So we've reduced the uranium oxide and uranium metal in that previous step. Now we load in the electrofiner. Now the fuel gets loaded into anode baskets, and our object is to recover pure uranium on the cathode. Okay, that's the process. Now, here's the electrochemistry, or here's the thermodynamics electrochemistry. So what I'm putting up here are sort of standard potentials, or standard reduction potentials. So versus chlorine electrode, these are the potentials that these different actinides reduce. So basically the lower the potential, the more energy you have to put into it in order to get it to go to a metal. So americium would much prefer to be in the salt than uranium. You know, if I start applying current, uranium will be the first to reduce, and then curium, plutonium, neptunium, americium. Well, and then you got rare earths. So these are like gadolinium chloride, neodymium chloride, cerium chloride, lanthanum chloride. Their potentials, which we actually measured this data. One of my students, Prashant Bagri, ran these experiments. They're all a lot less than these actinide potentials. Okay, so rare earth metals can actually reduce uranium metal. I mean that if I'm at a potential that, let's say, gadolinium starts to reduce, I'll definitely reduce uranium metal. Actually, I'll reduce all of these. So we kind of came up with this idea of like, well, what if we used gadolinium, that's the green curve, as our anode? Could we do a nice kind of controlled reduction of the actinides? This is the process we came up with. A galvanic reduction, where we actually create a galvanic coupling. We take the gadolinium, short it to a stainless steel rod. And the idea, based on these potentials, is the gadolinium will just spontaneously oxidize. It's like a battery. And the uranium will spontaneously reduce. And we'll be able to pull the uranium right out of the salt this way. That was it. And this would be what we call spontaneous long-range electronically mediated reduction. Did experiment. This is what our cell looked like. And there's the data. So let's look at the red curve. The red curve shows the concentration of UCl3 as a function of time. In a half an hour, we basically got rid of all the uranium out of the salt. The orange curve is the buildup of gadolinium, which we'd expect. After running this for 2 hours, we were actually below the detection limits for uranium. I've never cleaned uranium out of the salt so well as this process did. We added magnesium chloride. Magnesium chloride is actually a pretty good surrogate for plutonium chloride. And it shows that the uranium will still come out fast, very quickly, The plutonium would come out as well, just not as quickly. And then finally, we threw in a bunch of surrogate fission products like lanthanum, cerium, neodymium, and they all pretty much stayed steady, which is good. That's what we want. We don't want to take out the fission products. We want to just recover the uranium. So we can send everything else off to waste. And this shows that we can monitor this process using OCP, open circuit potential. Just measure the potential versus a reference electrode in the salt. At the start of the test, the potential was up here. And as we pulled uranium out of the salt, the OCP kept going down, down, down. So you can use this to actually monitor when's the reaction complete, which is very nice. Okay, not going to talk a lot about this because kind of running short on time. We tried it. We tried reduction also just by taking some lithium metal and throwing it in the salt. No electrodes. The result was terrible. We get very bad selectivity. So what we'd like to do is, like we were doing experiments with like lanthanum and cerium. We'd like to be able to reduce one but not reduce the other. And this shows we can't. We're showing that you're getting a pretty even, both of them are reducing along these curves. If we use cesium and lanthanum, pretty good, but cesium should be way more stable in the salt than lanthanum. But still, we were getting some cesium reduction. So in this case, we found that the short range reduction was much less selective than the long range reduction. Okay. Just a little bit of time to talk about corrosion control. It's a pretty cool application as well. I mentioned we're looking at fusion and salt-cooled fission reactors. ITER, shown here in the upper right, is currently being constructed in France as an international fusion reactor demonstration. They're not going to be using FLIBE in their breeder, but that was one concept that we looked at a number of years ago. It's still kind of coming back. I think some other fusion reactors may use FLIBE. The problem with using FLIBE is that this reaction occurs. Well, actually, it's not a problem. It's actually by design. Neutrons hit lithium-6 atoms and form tritium. Now, you need the tritium for the fusion reactor. The problem is it also forms tritium fluoride. And that is acidic. That's corrosive. So you have to be able to sort of react that, recycle the tritium, and you got to keep everything from corroding. Same thing with the salt cool reactor here that Kairos Power is currently designing. They also use FLIBE. They don't want to make this tritium, so they enrich the lithium to lithium-7, but they still form some tritium. And so the idea is, what do we deal with this? We're making all this tritium fluoride. How do we get rid of it? Well, the thing we figured out a number of years ago was we just add beryllium metal to the salt. This is an experiment where we took this beryllium metal rod, we inserted it into the salt. We insert anywhere from like 5 minutes to an hour, and then we'd pull the beryllium out of the salt, and we'd measure, we'd bubble HF into the salt, and we'd measure the effluent concentration. And you can see here, like this here, redox 8, basically no HF is coming out for like 15 hours before it starts to come out. What's happened is we've actually dissolved beryllium in the salt. We put so much beryllium in the salt, and this reaction happens very fast. Beryllium reacts to HF to form beryllium fluoride, and that's basically, it's like a redox buffer. And we found that, again, we could actually measure how much beryllium was dissolved in the salt. We would dunk these beryllium rods in the salt, but we got some weird results. We found that if we electrically isolated the beryllium rod, we got 0.011 mole% beryllium. If we galvanically coupled the beryllium rod to the nickel crucible, we got 0.2 to 0.3. So we never really resolved this problem. This was actually a project we worked on about 15 years ago. Don't really know what's going on, but it seems like even though we thought it was a short range reduction, there's something long range about this. And I'd love to have the opportunity to someday get back and study this some more. This shows some pictures of the beryllium rods. On the left here, this is the beryllium that was sort of shorted to the crucible. You can see it looks like it corroded pretty well. And the one on the right was electrically isolated. It didn't corrode nearly as much. So definitely something going on there with a galvanic effect. Okay, to conclude. So I really found this work by Akabe and Sadoway very interesting, even though it was developed for tantalum and titanium processing. I think it actually applies to all these different things I worked on in the last 20 years or so. I think that long-range electronic mediated reduction has a lot of benefits. We can a lot more selective. We can achieve higher solubility of redox buffers. A lot of things that seem to be, if we can push everything to long range, we can control it like with electrical cells. I think we have a lot of improvement we can make. All right, so anyway, I think that's pretty much it. I think I've got maybe 5 minutes.
Yeah, let's open it up for questions. So I'll start. First off, you talked about like the most toxic seminar I think I've seen today. You've got HF gas and chlorine gas and beryllium, for crying out loud. Is this a major concern for you in your experiments? Like,
I don't do any work with beryllium anymore. You know, it's interesting because I did the work of beryllium when I was actually an employee at Argonne, and I was driving to what was INEEL at the time, and those guys had set up this lab with HF and beryllium and molten salts, and I was just kind of like, I was designing the experiments, but I was kind of scared. And then when I came here, I just decided, you know what, I can do a lot of the work without having to touch beryllium.
Yeah.
And that's that's been where I've stayed, because there's just really, seriously, beryllium. I mean, there's a few, 2 or 3 universities in the country that are doing that work, and I'm like, all the power to them. It's a hard thing to deal with.
It's a horrible chemical.
Yeah.
Then I've got a technical question for you. So what's the reason why this short range is so much more reactive? Is it just because lithium, when it becomes lithium metal, is just so much more reactive? Or what is the reason why you're getting such poor selectivity when you do short range?
I think it's just I think it is the fact that the reaction kinetics are so fast.
Okay.
So you don't have any control. You lose your ability to control mass transfer and things like that. I think it just goes so. I mean, it just goes fast, and it's not. I think anything that happens really fast, you lose its selectivity. So you can kind of like slow it down in a way. You can enhance that selectivity, but I think you can still do it fast enough.
Yeah. Okay. Other questions from anybody?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could comment on some of the cost considerations for the short range versus the long range order processes.
It's a good question. Scaling up is always going to favor short range. Because you're going to have, like, think of it like you're doing tank reactors. You're just mixing chemicals together and you're letting them react. So that's definitely going to be a thing. You know, it's once you go, generally, if you go to electrochemical processing, then you become limited by areas of electrodes. So it's not without its challenges, for sure. But major metals like aluminum and magnesium are produced electrochemically, so I don't think it's out of the realm of consideration. The other thing that you also have to understand is that with these nuclear material processing, the throughput requirements are way lower than for an industrial metal. If you have a plant that's processing 1,000 tons per year, that's huge. I mean, that's as big as it ever gets. and that's pretty small for a metal processing plant. So, yeah, and that's an important consideration, you know, and you have to design around that. But I do think short range would be easier to scale up for sure.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Okay, we will thank our speaker then. Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. I love that you made this very accessible. Nuclear is something that is, whenever I see talks, it's easy to drift off and just feel lost right away. So thanks for teaching it at a level that at least I could understand. I appreciate it. So thanks for joining us this week.
I want to give a quick story that when I gave my my thesis talk in grad school at Princeton in chemical engineering, someone made I guess it was a compliment to me, saying it was the one presentation they were able to understand, like at all the seminars. And I didn't know, is that a compliment or is it just that my work is super simple?
No,
but
it's not
anyway.
simple. In fact, I recommend this to everybody. When you give talks, it's way, way better to explain things very simply than to lose your audience by what you might think is sounding smart, using lots of jargon or jumping right into it without providing background. So anyways, I think it's great. Thank you so much, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Taylor. And thanks everyone for tuning in.
See y'all next week.